Right guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. A fascinating story emerging today as to exactly why Ferrari have such a power deficit to Mercedes this season. It turns out this was a deliberate choice. The way that they've designed the engine is incredibly unorthodox and abnormal. It does have some disadvantages, but some major advantages as well. And with the ADUO shortly coming into effect, if the power goes up, some of the other benefits might be able to be reaped the rewards of as well. What are Ferrari cooking and exactly why? Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This, of course, is Max Verstappen because it is race week. It is not race week in Formula 1 again, but it is race week at the Nordschleife. It's the 24 hours of Nürburgring this weekend on the 16th, 17th. Max Verstappen, of course, will be driving there. It's a big deal, right? He's had a couple of NLS races that have gone well in terms of pace, not so well in terms of overall results. But for the first time, I believe, ever, according to the discussion today, all the tickets across the weekend and the race have been sold out for the first time in history of this 24-hour race. So Max Verstappen is turning heads for sure. And I saw Danny Gadella in replies like, what do you mean, right? What do you mean it's all about Max? Come on, do you not know that I'm racing there this year? But yes, it's a big story. We'll follow that over the next couple of days, certainly when it all gets underway this weekend. The other thing I wanted to get into was some updates on Williams. I know lots of you guys are hopeful that Williams will finally put it together, find a way to be competitive again at the business end in Formula 1. This season, they've not done that. But of course, if you look at some of the numbers, you'll realise, okay, the start of the season was terrible, but they did get a double points finish in Miami, and they become only the fifth team to have done that. Red Bull have not got a double points finish. Of course, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, and Alpine have done so as well, with Gasly and Colapinto, but Williams now become the fifth team to join that list so far this season after the fourth round of the year, which, given the start of the season was so bad, is, I guess, not all that bad at the end of the day. And the question has become, can they do enough to convince the likes of a Carlos Sainz that actually staying at Williams is the way to go? Now, look, of course, if Ferrari get on the phone and say, hey, we want you back, or if Mercedes, it's never going to happen, but you know what I mean? It was a conversation for Mercedes when people said, oh, they should leave Antonelli at Williams for a year or something and sign Sainz instead. They didn't do that. I think that decision has been vindicated. But if Sainz gets a better offer, yeah, obviously he's going to have to consider it. But will Williams do enough to convince him to stay, that their project actually does have potential legs in the future? And according to some rumours, the negotiations are underway. Now, this is probably about the time of the year that we are going to start to see more rumours around driver stuff, because a lot of driver contracts are up at the end of this or the next year. I'm sure that especially over the next 2-3 months when the summer really gets underway, we are going to hear a lot in terms of driver rumours for the next couple of seasons, because the competitive picture is now starting to become relatively clear here for these regulations. And especially with changes getting defined for next year as well, people kind of know where they stand. Williams, though, believe that they can be a lot faster than they currently are. And, you know, the Spaniard has apparently rejected a 4-year contract with Alpine in June 2024. So the question will be, will he want to commit to Williams for a little bit longer than he currently is? That will depend on whether James Vowles can continue to convince him. And I thought it was interesting what Vowles had to say on their issues before the season even started. We know that they did an awful lot over the last few years, changing up their processes, the software they used to try to make it a more streamlined operation. Vowles came over from Mercedes and were like, what are you clowns doing? We've got to rip this all down and go up again from the bottom. And that affected them for a couple of years. But the intention was it was all going to pay off spectacularly so in 2026. Vowles, though, says, we made a lot of changes a few years ago, putting in an ERP, an enterprise resource planning, a PLM, a product lifecycle management systems, all the acronyms. It's Formula 1, right? What else do we do here? Different ways of doing planning, structuring, working. This was the first proper car built with all those into account. But we made some mistakes on that software. It was our first proper go at planning a completely new regulation car from start to finish. And after we did it, we realized, okay, we made quite a lot of mistakes and with just a few small errors, and that added up to inefficiencies. It meant they were behind in certain areas. We started early in the wind tunnel. We wanted to stress ourselves to the limit of, trying to pretend we were a championship team. He says not quite, but we wanted to be more aggressive. We produced as a result a very complex car with near enough double the amount of parts that they've had in previous cars. That meant it was more complicated. But look, you could argue that the problems they suffered and what they're learning from it will put them in a position to try to be more of a championship contender in the coming years. Maybe you've got to make the mistakes first, and I don't think that, sacking Vowles and saying that, oh, he has to take the fall for this is the right solution. He says that once they realised they were behind, if they needed parts made by other manufacturers, they were busy with other teams and other programs, so then they fall even further behind. They then failed a couple of the crash tests. He emphasises that some of them they passed incredibly well. It's like, okay, congrats, right? Like, you didn't pass all of them incredibly well, did you? So it doesn't really matter. But he says, yeah, we started to run out of time, and as a result, the car became very heavy very quickly. But, he does describe the goal for the immediate term, because it looks like things have taken some strides in the right direction. Of course, there's a balance between trying to drop the weight and also actually adding aerodynamic performance. But he says the pit stops, we're back in business on that front. And the goal is effectively to get back to the front of the midfield. That was what he said. Here it is. After the August break, after we finished developing this car, that the car is sensibly back to being the top of the midfield with everything in a sensible position, building on next year's car. So, look, by the end of the year, Williams are still planning to be quicker than Alpine, basically. I don't expect Alpine to promote themselves, as it were, into the front runners. So I think the logic for Williams is we need to end the year, if you're Williams, as not the slowest Mercedes-powered team. That will be the goal, and if they can do that, then I think they will give confidence that, okay, maybe they do still know to some degree what they're doing after all. But it is interesting that Williams upgrades they brought in Miami, some of the parts they brought, they were meant to be on the car in Melbourne. And that's how far behind they were, right? So you could argue that, well, they brought in Miami, the car that they should have had in Melbourne, and to be honest, they wanted even a better car in Melbourne than they eventually had, and it was a car that could score a couple of points in Miami. So maybe the trajectory isn't as bad as it initially appeared. The other just quick update is that it does appear that Formula One, here's Ben Sulliam, here's Domenicali, are really figuring out that what they do with these regulations isn't going to massively affect what the manufacturers think. As we've said over the last few days, if you tell the manufacturers, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, what are they going to do? Pull out of the sport? Sell their teams worth billions of dollars that seem to only be growing, given it's effectively a franchise nowadays with difficult entry requirements. So it feels more likely that, in fact, to potentially encourage even further manufacturers in the future, maybe the way to go now is to go the other way. And it's kind of interesting, this, because when we designed, I say we, these regulations were designed in, let's say, 2020, 2021 for 2026, so we have now. It was the thinking, okay, we want to get Porsche, we want to get Audi, we want to try and make sure Honda come back, make sure we keep Mercedes and Ferrari happy, and all of this is like, okay, the big manufacturers, how can we convince them to come in? And at the time, the feeling and the politics was electric, it's got to be electric, we've got to push 50-50 and try and go further in the future and all of this. That was all the rage. Nowadays, the argument is maybe somewhat different. The teams, those manufacturers recognise that, okay, combustion still has its place in the mainstream and in the world more widely, sustainable fuels and all this type of stuff. They're not going to sell their spots anyway, given how valuable they are and seem to only be growing, one would imagine. So maybe the argument is now the other way around. How about we had, teams like Alpine, of course Renault have pulled out, as we know, but even other teams further down the grid, could there be other interest in manufacturers for Formula One if the engines were less complicated? Because, yeah, you get maybe the big manufacturers by going for the big complex route, but maybe if they're going to stay anyway, actually the way to get even some maybe further, more independent manufacturers, because the other teams aren't going to abandon the sport as it stands, is actually to go the other way. Straightforward 2.4 litre naturally aspirated V8. I'm down for that. I don't think it's especially likely. I guess we'll see. Let's talk about Ferrari. Günther Steiner's back at it again. He does talk a lot, kind of like Ralf Schumacher, but he's not wrong in this case, that with Ferrari, it appears there's always something. The last little bit is always missing. And this season, as we know, the last little bit is just the power. It's the deployment. The aero package is clearly very strong. It is almost certainly the strongest on the grid overall, I think we would argue, and we'll see more evidence for that here in a second. But it's not good enough to win races right now, and it's not good enough to win the championship right now. So Auto Racer put out an article. They talk about the Miami package and say that, look, it's worked. It's maybe not worked as spectacularly as was hoped, but it's also worth considering there was only one practice session before the sprint. But also they did have that whole filming day in Monza, right, where they did have plenty of opportunities to test a new package. So there is understandable conversations about, is correlation as good as it could be? Because Hamilton said the correlation wasn't great between what he had on the sim and what they had on the track, whereas McLaren turned up and seemingly their package was absolutely nailed straight out of the gate. But the discussion is the package works, especially the slow corners. The car has become better, but it's no better on the straights. The limitation on the straight in terms of drag and in terms of engine performance is still there. The downforce is there, but it can't quite get the traction and it can't quite get that progression into full throttle the way that the Mercedes can. And the reverse wing does reduce part of the drag, but it's not been enough to offset the power, the deployment, and the efficiency advantage of the Mercedes. So while it might have the most downforce, it might be the best chassis. Is it the most efficient chassis when it comes to the downforce versus drag conversation? Quite possibly not. However, the very interesting article was out of the Italian press, again, but Motorsport Italia. They talk about the engine, right? Because I think it's been an understandable conversation. We think Mercedes have the most horsepower from the combustion engine, maybe upwards to about 580 horsepower. That's been rumoured. We think that Red Bull are quite close, maybe 570 horsepower. Rumour has it Ferrari might be down at 550, right? So it does beg the question, how come Ferrari, with all of their Enzo Ferrari aerodynamics, are for those who can't build engines, right? Like, that's what Ferrari do. They build engines. And how are they so far behind? Given that Red Bull, brand new power unit, they're apparently near enough there with Mercedes. Audi literally were saying from day dot that they were going to be way behind in combustion power. Apparently they are roughly where Ferrari are, according to various rumours. So how have they built an engine that is so weak, relatively? I mean, we're talking about them getting 4% ADUO, which was, well, could be good for them, but also was kind of bad. Or how are you so far behind? Now, let's not forget they did have this Wolf Zimmermann project. They were working on an engine design which apparently was not working especially well. On the test bench, they had to abandon it. Zimmermann is gone, and it's now Enrico Gualtieri leading up the show on the engine side. But according to this report today, which is very fascinating actually, what they've done with their engine is to design it to operate at far higher temperatures than traditional engines. You may remember a while ago, and the article again describes it, we talked about Ferrari using steel cylinder heads rather than aluminium, which of course would be heavier but would be able to withstand higher pressures and temperatures. So the intention for a lot of engines is to have the intake air 70 to 80 degrees. In fact, the Ferrari engine is a lot hotter than that. Apparently the secret of the actual value is guarded like Fort Knox, but it's well over 100 degrees Celsius. So they've clearly innovated in some regard and created an engine which can operate at far higher operating temperatures beyond that which would normally be possible. However, this is not optimal. Like, from a physics perspective, this is not optimal, but it does have other advantages, right? But this apparently is a lot of the gap. In maximum power, this is where the gap is. Engines, they don't like to generally be too hot, and Ferrari have designed it to be hot. So it's like, why, first of all? And why would you give up that, let's say, deficit in maximum power? The article describes it somewhere around 10 to maybe 12 horsepower they're giving up with this intention. So then you might argue, well, okay, why? Well, if the engine is operating at higher temperatures, then you don't need the same cooling requirements as the other cars would have, which means, as they describe here, you get a lighter cooling system, reduced radiating mass in the side pods, and it also allows you to do more extreme things with the aerodynamics, the shape of the side panel. So it all seems to be aligned, right? We talk about, oh wow, Ferrari, they have the best chassis, they seem to have the most downforce. That appears to actually be a consequence of their engine design. They've designed an engine that requires less cooling, and therefore they can do more interesting and spectacular things with the aero than the other teams can. But that is purely part of the trade-off that they have come up with. So apparently, yeah, the Ferrari engine is 10 to 12 horsepower down than where Mercedes can be because of these higher temperatures, but they will intend to offset that by better aero efficiency. And also, because the engine's hotter, the exhaust gases are hotter, that makes the FTM, this piece at the back of the car here, the balloon diffuser, even more effective. Now, there has, of course, been talk about banning this for next year, which would potentially hurt Ferrari very greatly. They then describe how the turbocharger is roughly 10 millimeters smaller in diameter compared to the Mercedes one or the Red Bull one, which, you know, it's only a centimeter, might not seem like a lot, but that's a relatively significant change, which also gives up 7 horsepower at the higher revs. So if we're talking that the deficit is roughly 30 horsepower to Mercedes, 7 of that, we think, is, let's say it's 35. I'm going to say roughly half anyway of the deficit. So 7 horsepower of it is from the turbo, and maybe another 10 or 12 is from purely the design from a physics perspective. So that accounts for like 20 horsepower of the deficit, which means that if the Ferrari is, let's say, 30, 35 horsepower down, then half of that is maybe recoverable, but the other half of that is maybe unrecoverable. And this is what the article goes on to describe, that these ideas mean that they are naturally going to be behind in power, but they are intending to make that up in other ways. You know, can they generate enough rear downforce that no other car can? It seems that yes, they can, but right now they're just lacking top power, which Mercedes have. So the article describes how the ADUO intends to, they believe that they can halve the deficit, right? Let's say they're at 550, Mercedes are at 580. They think they can get to, let's say, 565, but that remaining 15 is probably impossible, right? Like, if they keep the mechanics of the engine the same way that we've described them in this video. And if they, apparently, yeah, they will intend to retain the turbo. There was some discussion on this. Would they go for a bigger turbo in the next selection? Will they, or for the next engine with the upgrades, will they keep the same turbo? But apparently, yeah, they might keep the same version currently with the advantages that has. And, you know, they talk about in Miami, the rear tires and some of the other problems they've had. And if they were to ban the FTM, then it puts them in a real pickle. But that's what we understand. It's a very interesting development, I thought, that they've made some changes deliberately to try to have a trade-off. And I don't know if part of their intention was to get this ADUO, right? Because I do wonder whether this is always part of their plan. They're making decisions that deliberately limit the pure output of their power unit. So then they can go to the FIA and say, aha, we're like 30 horsepower down, we need some more juice, right? And let's say they were only 15 horsepower down, and that whole deficit was just due to the decisions that we have discussed. They would presumably still get the ADUO anyway to help them find a bit more performance. So, or maybe the FIA's rules actually say, no, we treat things statically and none of these conversations matter. But, you know, I'm sure Mercedes might have some thoughts on that. Point is, Ferrari are hoping that they can halve their deficit. And look, that could be enough. I mean, right now, the discussion is the Ferrari power unit is responsible for losing probably half a second a lap, something like that, to the Mercedes, whereas their actual pace deficit is more like, at least based on Miami, 2 to 3 tenths maybe. So let's say their engine was improved substantially, that might be dead even, right? They might still have an engine deficit, they probably inevitably will based on this discussion, but that will be made up for with superior aero, and they can still get closer on the engine side than they currently are. Of course, the concern really is that that was kind of the deficit in Miami, but Mercedes still have more to come, right? Yes, they might not get the ADUO for the better engine, but they have more aero upgrades in the works as well. So it's not quite as clear as, oh, well, Ferrari have a new engine in a couple of months, and when they bring it, they're going to be right there with Mercedes on power, and therefore they're then going to be the fastest car. It's not quite that simple. There have been various trade-offs that have led us to this point, but nonetheless, I thought it was pretty interesting. So intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments below. Bernie Ecclestone's back at it again as well. He says, Antonelli or Verstappen will be world champion. champion. Red Bull has apparently overcome the slump. Max has rediscovered his fire, and when he does, he's dangerous. I don't know, has Max fully rediscovered the fire? I'm not sure. Look, if the Red Bull's good enough, Max will give it a good go, but if it's between Antonelli or Verstappen right now, if I had to choose one of the two, I think there's only one answer. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.